Welcome to the Real Clear Investigations Podcast. I'm your host, Peder Zane, editor of Real Clear Investigations, joined as always by Real Clear senior reporter, James Varney. Hey, Jim.
Hi, Peder.
We are really excited today. We're going to be joined in a little bit by Professor Gary Saul Morson, who is a professor of Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University, who's going to talk to us about what Russian literature can teach us about the modern progressive movement. Before we get going, I want to thank you all for watching us. Please leave comments below the YouTube, and also don't forget that you can listen to us on Spotify and Apple and wherever else you get podcasts. So please do that and let us know how we're doing. We read all the comments, for good or ill. Well, Jim, busy news week, and we're going to start with a Wall Street Journal story that reminded me in some ways about what we were talking about during COVID, and that was this reliance on Chinese supply chains. And one of the ways where this is coming into the fore is with the production of drones, and specifically with batteries and other components that are essential not just to build an individual drone, but to bring them up to scale. And you had a big article in RCI about batteries this week. So tell me a little bit about what your thinking is in reading this article about trying to move the U.S. off dependency on Chinese parts for some of the drones.
Yeah, we actually we have a hyperlink to the journal story in our piece, and we mentioned this. And it also goes back to what you and I were talking about earlier with the Pentagon trying to become more nimble with weapons procurement. So basically, I guess Hegseth is wanting to spend, I think it was $1.1 billion, and they're trying to get drone dominance. And, you know, drones are like the latest gizmo in warfare because they've been used quite extensively in the Ukraine and now Iran. That seems to be about their only weapon they have left. And so you've been hearing a lot about drones. And obviously, it's something that if China has got a stranglehold on the materials or the technology, that could be a problem. I think it's also a problem in terms of, like you just mentioned, bringing it up to scale, right? You need like thousands of these things to have a stockpile of any real value.
I think Ukraine's going through 10,000 a month, they said. Just Ukraine.
I mean, it's easy. You can see how you get depleted at that rate. And I think, though, that I think you and I also talked about this. We mentioned the drones maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago in connection with the Iran war. I don't think they're going to change the game. At the end of the day, you're not going to win a war, I don't think, with drones.
Right.
But it is obviously something that the Pentagon is trying to get on top of. And it looks like, after all these experts told me that defense was one area where the U.S. battery technology is still cutting edge and elite, maybe there is something, a little bit of a gap between us and Trump.
And there's, also just a tension between, the world has made many more cheaper goods available to more people through outsourcing, through finding the cheapest place to make certain things. So there's a attraction on one level to sort of Fortress America, and we make everything for ourselves. But you go too far down that route in a global world, and you're limited in what you can make, and you're paying much higher prices for it. So where that sort of Goldilocks space is of being dependent on others who can produce things you need more cheaply, and still not being so dependent on them that they can cut you off, a la the Straits of Hormuz and oil, is a tough thing to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
So another story in the news is, again, he was Roger Pielke, who was on our podcast a few weeks ago, and he kind of teased this, I think, when he said that there's a new report coming out that is going to make a real difference in how we understand climate change. And in fact, he has a Substack item that is very technical. So good luck to you if you all can follow every nook and cranny of it. But he also has a bunch of takeaways. And the main takeaway is that the most extreme scenarios that have been blasted by Al Gore and others for decades are now being eliminated from the chief report on climate change. That's a big deal, right?
I think so. And it'll be interesting to see if Pielke's Substack piece and this fact that he's reporting get wide dissemination. Because basically what we're saying is that the apocalyptic versions of global warming and the end of the world kind of thing, the whole idea that it is an existential threat is false. And as you mentioned, there was a teaser in that. The IPCC reports, and Pielke said this in our podcast, they have always been more measured than they tend to be reported as. And so there's been, the truth has been out there, so to speak, that these extreme results and the biggest swings in temperature change probably aren't going to happen. And in fact, the more precise the inputs got in these computer models, because it's all computer models, nobody knows what's going to happen in 50 years. They don't even know if it's going to rain this weekend, So the more precise those get, the smaller the increase in temperature has been. So it is very important to kind of knock out the underpinnings of the existential threat.
Right. And obviously, the Earth is getting warmer. There will be changes because of that. But I think Pielke's piece reminds us of another previous guest we had, Jacob Siegel, and the information state, that the narrative that was advanced with the most extreme situations was clearly, because like you said, there was plenty of scientific evidence that those were just the high ends and not the most likely outcomes, that this was a power grab. This was a way to both redistribute wealth to other countries and also to have government power over energy and how we live and what we do. And I think that's also an important part of being skeptical in this world, is when somebody's telling you something, what's their interest in all in that?
That's a fundamental question. And as you were just pointing, it all comes back to the RCI podcast, doesn't it? Like, that's the talk about.
It's bizarre. So we're going to, and this is actually a perfect segue, because we're going to bring Professor Morrison on a little bit and talk about, how ideology, makes you see the world in a certain way. And certainly ideology was one of the reasons, and many others, that political leaders and some scientists cast global warming as an existential threat when the evidence was clear that it wasn't. But now we saw this week that the Palisades fires in Los Angeles may have been set or by a man who was a fan of Luigi Mangione, and that these fires were part of a larger effort to punish billionaires, to, take it out on the rich and whatever. And I think what we saw with the White House Correspondents' Dinner attack is these people are, on the one hand, unhinged. You don't just set fires. You're not going to accomplish what you want. And yet they're not crazy, right?
Yeah, they certainly aren't the kind of people that you think would be in Bellevue, right? Or that need a straitjacket. And this is also yet another example. These things happen. They aren't climate change more often than not. They're started by people, or there is another cause. It isn't climate change. It's not global warming. So why Luigi Mangione has become something of an idol, like to this guy who I guess had been also telling, I guess he was an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, and the article was talking about how his customers were saying the guy seemed a little wacko. I don't know how this has become such a, sexy topic for people, but it does, as you say, underscore the notion that people taking extreme steps are sort of taking the next logical step as far as they're concerned, because of what they're absorbing and what they're reading and what they're hearing. This seems to make sense to them. It's not like somebody says, well, the little green man told me to do this. It's something that people that he knows, he thinks, are telling him to do.
Well, and in fact, again, like the White House Correspondents' Dinner assassin, the language that this person used was verbatim what you're hearing from Elizabeth Warren and other Democratic leaders. And obviously, people on the other side repeat Trump and his. It's not a completely one-way street, but we have certainly seen much more of this violence. And really, as we said last week, it's the response to it. It's the Mangione was so dangerous, not just because he gunned down a guy on the street, which
Allegedly.
is horrible enough for that guy and his family, who will never recover from that, who will always have a huge hole in their hearts and their souls. But the acclaim, the celebration, and we had mentioned that New York Times podcast with Hassan Piker and others, but this is the New York Times has a podcast in which that death was discussed not as a moral outrage and what's wrong with any progressive who supports that, but whether or not it was an effective tactic.
Yeah.
Did we get what we wanted out of that death, or are there better ways to achieve the revolution?
And this will come up with Professor Morrison in a moment, but the failure to condemn that is really telling. And we need to be more outspoken when things like what happened with the United Health guy, or what happened outside the Israeli embassy, or what happened with the Democrats who got shot in Minnesota. All of these things are way out of bounds. And it needs to be stated clearly and repeatedly that these are not solutions to the problem.
Exactly. And that brings us to our featured interview today with Professor Gary Saul Morson, who is a professor of the Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University, and who is a scholar of Russian literature, who's going to talk to us about the parallels that we can see in the great Russian novels, and especially of Dostoevsky and others, and what they tell us about the modern progressive left. We're especially excited to welcome our guest today, Gary Saul Morson, who is a professor of Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University. One of the reasons Jim and I got into journalism or a main reason, is that you get to meet people who know stuff you don't know, and can really enlighten your world. And just like literature, it's people who have spent time thinking about the world and can help the rest of us bring it into sharper focus. So first, Dr. Morson, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm a real fan of all you do. So,
wow.
Well,
Thank you so much for that. And let's just start off. I want to begin with something that you noted in one of your essays. The Communist Manifesto proclaimed that a specter was haunting Europe in 1848, the specter of communism. In the New Criterion last year, you wrote that, but today it is more like a zombie, unexpectedly risen from the dead. And alluding to Francis Fukuyama's post-Soviet Union essay on the end of history, you wrote that history did not end. It had just taken a brief nap. Can you tell us a little bit about why communism persists?
yeah, well, what's quite amazing that, in spite of everything that we know about, what, the Soviet regime was like, the Maoist regime in Cambodia, more brutal than probably anything else has ever been, people still seem, to be gravitating to it again. It seemed to go completely out of fashion when the Soviet Union fell. I remember being in a London bookshop, and I could buy all their Marxism, Leninism books for almost nothing because nobody wanted them back then, right? But now, you have, what is it, Hassan Piker saying the great tragedy was the fall of the Soviet Union. The mayor of New York uses language like seize the means of production, which is, Marxist language. Where does this come from, is the question. How does it get revived? It looked like, the idea was dead. In practice, it was dead. And then it seems to be having a revival. What is causing this is a really interesting question that one might think about.
First, can we just lay out the landscape a little bit? And, I'm guessing that this is a sort of a technical, complex arguments around this. But I think the first thing is, what do we call it? Because if you start saying, oh, you're a communist or you're a Marxist, and they deny that, although democratic socialism is now a term that has come into vogue. And as you write in one of your essays, Solzhenitsyn said that term is like saying ice cold heat, because there's no democracy in socialism. But one of the things I got from reading a bunch of your essays in Commentary, The New Criterion, The Wall Street Journal, is so many ideas that Marxism and communism advanced that Dostoevsky in particular highlighted in many of his novels, especially The Devils, about pre-revolutionary Russia. And I just want to go through a small list here. The group over the individual, which is DEI, defining us in groups. Equity over equality. And one of the problems there is when you can't raise people up, you have to lower everyone down. The repeating of revolutionary slogans as scientific facts. And we see all over Twitter just this repetition of these slogans, the same ones in this sort of groupthink. The idea that there are final solutions, and that was really interesting. You note that Dostoevsky used that term, final solutions to social problems. No moral code. So humanity is the master of the universe, which means there are no principles and no guardrails. And we see that, as you referenced, the candidate in Maine who had a Nazi tattoo is now the chief candidate for the party that has called all of its enemies Nazis. And then I want to get to this later, but the importance of violence. But how should we talk about, is it fair to say that this is communism, this is Marxism? And what are the main animating ideas that Dostoevsky was describing in the 1880s that we're seeing today?
There's so many questions there. Let me start with democratic socialism. When Michael Harrington started that party, he called it democratic socialist because he had in mind, socialism of not really socialism, but welfare state, extreme welfare, like in Sweden, which is not really socialist because the economy still allows for. But that's what European socialist parties had turned into by that point. Socialism was kind of an honorific term that was related to what they used to believe in, but now, they no longer wanted to run the whole economy, but just have a welfare state. And that's the kind of thing that originally that party stood for. It. So democratic meant you still had democratic liberties and elections, but it's also the case that, the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, when they took over East Germany, called it the German Democratic Republic. I mean, all the communist regimes called themselves democratic. And Marxists, when I was growing up, I remember this is true democracy, not like your bourgeois democracy. So when people say, I'm a democratic socialist, you have to ask, well, which do they mean? And I think what's happened with that party is that it's moved from one definition to the other. Right? It's now democratic in the sense that a communist totalitarian regime is democratic, that is, it claims to represent the people. Right. In that sense, so
you're saying that the left, the liberals who still probably think of socialism as democratic socialism, as the benign, soft, weak welfare states of Europe, has sort of ceded power to the far more sharp-edged, ideological, and aggressive understanding of the Marxists and communists.
My guess is that the leadership knows exactly what it's doing, but that you attract followers by being a little vague and all we believe in is, making the rich pay their fair share. We believe in rent control. We believe in government-run grocery stores. You don't say, we believe in seizing the entire means of production and dictating everybody's lives. You don't say that, okay? But, and this is standard, communist operating, communist parties in Europe did the same thing. I mean, that's how you gain support, right? And you rely on now you can rely on the fact that most people do not know what happened in the Soviet. People who grew up, my students, for example, they have only the vaguest idea because it's not taught. And so in school, so they don't know, if you try to describe the most basic facts about the Soviet Union, about, the Gulag and the terror, they simply don't know this stuff, So it's easy to say, to just appeal, to the great ideals of equality, and, people won't know. I mean,
They weren't alive when the Soviet Union existed. Your students.
But I wasn't alive when the French Revolution took place, but I learned about it in school. You don't have to be. There's an old joke about.
But they have no personal experience of something like that existing on Earth while they're there. So,
I remember when I was growing up, there was a joke about the mother who said her son failed, the history exam, but it wasn't his fault. They asked him about things that happened before he was born.
Well, you actually say in your essays, this is also a strategy, because a hallmark of the hard left is to erase the past so that you can build the future. So in some ways, it's very intentional that these students don't know much about the past, or when they are taught the past, it's that, especially American history, it's shameful, it's useless, and so why bother with it?
Yeah, you don't want the history to be known when it's not, in your favor, and then you want to change the history when of the U.S. so that it looks like the way the communists always described the U.S. So that becomes a conscious strategy. I don't think it's it's innocent. I think a lot of people don't know this, but the leadership knows exactly what it's doing. I partly think that because when I was growing up, the people surrounding me were either communists or people or ex-communists, but who were communists with a small c still, right? And I knew how they think. The atmosphere that produced Bernie Sanders was the one I kind of grew up around, so I knew it. And I can tell you that AOC speaks the same language. He must have grown up in a similar culture just decades later. I'm not sure about the mayor of New York, because he had, Marxist parents who were from elsewhere. That may be a different route to it. But, the culture continued, clearly as a kind of subculture, and then could resurface again. So leadership always knows what it's doing and knows precisely what to say to people who are, what the people Lenin called the useful idiots.
Well, I'm for one very happy that you're here, and I want to thank you for the stuff you've written about Russian translations, which you and I were just talking about. But for Peder and I, we grew up and we met in an intellectual environment where, as a professor, you probably know this, you would see all over campus that maroon spine for the Marx Engels reader and the other one for the Lenin anthology. Yeah. And there was a lot of Cohen's Bukharin and the Russian Revolution. So these were like three standard texts. And I had professors who were openly Marxists. Now, this was a few years ago. And my question to you is, I have a couple of questions. And one is, Russia at the time that the revolution happens in 1917, but let's say from the beginning of the 20th century to 1917, just like here in the beginning of the 21st century to now, they had a class of professional revolutionaries, right? Like people like Lenin and these guys. And then he had his guys robbing banks, thugs like Stalin, and he would do, mostly in Europe, the sort of intellectual talk and push the party on and keep the party together. Do you see today in the U.S. a kind of class of professional revolutionaries? I mean, is that what a guy like Pielke or these people living in $1 million Brooklyn townhomes that want to play at communism? Who are the revolutionaries, in your opinion, now here in the U.S.?
Well, I'm wondering about that because, when you can get at the drop of a hat Antifa mobs out on the street, that doesn't happen unless people are, conditioned and trained and ready for that. And in some sense that, they're a cadre of such people. So I'm wondering how that happens. I really don't know. But part of what you describe, when you mention educated professors and wealthy people, is precisely what happened in Russia. That is, the revolutionaries were not primarily, the peasants and workers,
right,
but the intelligentsia, which was a term we get from Russian, but in Russia it meant not intellectuals. It meant politically committed revolutionaries. You didn't even have to read a book to be a member of the intelligentsia. You had to have the right ideology, and that you can always get professors and equivalent educated people to sign up for that, because if the communists win, they are the rulers, or at least they think so.
Right.
And so, people who think they should be rulers don't like a capitalist society because professors are not the wealthiest people. They're not the most powerful, right? So you can always appeal to them and say, you should be the ones in charge. You are the scientists. You know that it will never fail, okay? People, you don't have to convince people that they should be getting more. I mean, anyone will follow it. And this ideology does that to intellectuals.
So do you see essentially then this concentration of Marxism that we see within the ivory tower in the academy over the past decades? Is that what is, in your opinion, become something like an intelligentsia here in the U.S.?
I think that's part of it, but it's also I think that's the core of it. But you also clearly have other groups, and I don't know where exactly they're coming from. I don't think everybody who comes out as an Antifa mob is a professor. So there's some other group there which you've gotten there.
Well, someone has to pay for it all.
Somebody's paying for it, right? Somebody's organizing it. It's there's something else, and that also would be very much like in what happened in Russia. Russia was a place where, starting in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, it was a place of mass terrorism. Okay, terror. If you asked a young man or a woman, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" the answer might be terrorist. It was a respected profession. Okay, there were years when it ran in families. Your Uncle Anton was a terrorist. Why can't you be? There were years when there were thousands of people killed in terrorist actions, right? I mean, one of my favorite stories about this is it's about 1907, when a reporter asks his editor, "Well, there's a new governor in the province. Shall we run his biography?" And the answer is, "No, save it for the obituary."
Yeah, they got a saw.
Now you have I'm told some high administration officials have to live on military bases because their families have been threatened. Okay, that's kind of when you get Supreme Court justices being besieged by mobs, attempted assassination, arson of the governor of Pennsylvania. This is like what Russia, only they're not succeeding so much, but it's very much on the way. We're not there yet, but it's a recognizable phenomenon because, you're getting people used to settle problems by violence so that if they ever achieve power, it will be,
violent.
Obvious that that's what you do.
So one of the things that you wrote in your essays that's totally on point here. One is Hamas, Hezbollah, the acceptance of that violence by the same people who are the progressive left in the United States. But you also pointed out that terror in Russia, was initially people who were unhinged. You throw acid in somebody's face, you plant a bomb. They were outliers. They were, some of them ideologues, but some of them disturbed people. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in the United States now with this most recent, attempt on Trump's life at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the two people who were, murdered outside of the Israeli embassy by a man shouting "Free Palestine," is these people are doing crazy things, but they're not crazy because violence has been normalized. And the response of people who support them, think of Luigi Mangione. I mean, he shot a man down in the street in cold blood.
Allegedly.
And otherwise normal, civilized people didn't have a problem with that. I mean,
that shows how far. I mean, can you imagine? I can't imagine even 10 years ago, most of the American left, let's say the left wing of the Democratic Party, celebrating a Mangione. I just can't imagine that 10 years ago. It has changed very rapidly, into that situation. A Mangione is now, a sexy figure, but more important than the ones who, actually celebrate it are the ones who don't believe in it, but will not say anything against it. Because that's a larger group, and they are the ones who really matter. Okay?
And I want to ask
there aren't enough of the killers, but that group will determine what happens. If Schumer doesn't condemn it, then we're in trouble. Okay.
And you've written about that, Professor, that the liberals in Russia, right, the cadets and other liberals, they seem to get pushed aside as the violent group grows. And then the other problem they have is that at each step of the way, they throw their lot with the revolutionaries because they have this common enemy and they all or at least agree that we need to have fundamental change. Right. And so I was wondering, do you see that happening? And it sounds like you do a little bit, that the classical liberal part of the Democratic Party or the left in the U.S. seems to be getting pushed aside and this radical part rising, which is what happened in Russia. Do you see a mirror kind of image of that happening here?
Yeah, the constitutional Democrats, the Liberal Party, which were far more numerous than the revolutionaries. I mean, most professionals were members of it, right? They did not believe in violence, but they wouldn't condemn it. And okay, one of the leaders at one point said after a mass terrorist attack, condemn terror? That would be the moral death of our party. Okay, now, of course, when the revolutionaries when the Bolsheviks took over, basically the first thing they did was to declare the cadets, quote, outside the law, which meant anyone could do anything to them. And within weeks, two of their leaders who happened to be in their hospital beds were murdered in their hospital beds. Okay, and, they thought, the cadets clearly thought that, they could use these people to force the government to reforms, and they would run the reforms and they would be in power. And indeed, immediately after the revolution, when you had a provisional government, it looked for a while like that might happen. But when the Bolsheviks did take over a few months later, they and the other socialists were the first victims, of it. The people who will really decide which way we go are, the liberals who believe in reform, who, have progressive principles, but who don't believe, but still believe in democracy and still believe in, don't believe in violence, but are intimidated at the moment. Intimidated both morally, because they don't want to be against those people, and intimidated perhaps physically, because they don't want to be the next victims. Those are the people who will decide what really happens, because they are the most numerous, right? And if they stand up, are they going to be Fettermans or are they going to be, I don't know, Schumers? I mean, which are they going to be? And, I'm not entirely convinced of I don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, I know it tends to be, it's leaning in the wrong direction now, but that doesn't mean things are hopeless. I mean, but it certainly seems like it's going in that direction. And the Russian example should be cautionary to them. They will be the ones who get it. I mean, first.
And to your point, too, I mean, I think one of the things Jim mentioned was the common enemy. So one of the strategies that you get for cowering liberals and bringing them along is the idea that we are up against such a monstrous force. Trump is not simply a president we disagree with. He's a fascist. He's a party of white supremacy. He is, upsetting the rule of law. I mean, so one of the things that you've written about in your essays is that you make your enemy so beyond the pale that the people in the middle don't feel like they have an option because they either support the aggressive policies you're doing against the monster, or they're supporting the monster. I mean, it puts them in a real catch-22, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly that if you call your enemy Hitler, anybody who had the chance to kill Hitler should have done so. So what you are saying is, go kill these people. That's really what you're saying if you call them Hitlers. Right. Okay, if one extremist does it, that doesn't mean that. But if more mainstream people do it, like, Tim Waltz, right? I mean, if people like that do it, or at least don't say anything against it, then what you're calling for is it's okay to kill these people. I mean, either to gain power or once you get power. I mean, that's the problem with that. Who really believes that, anyone who votes for Trump must be a white supremacist or a fascist? Some people believe it. But I think most people know it's, well, it's a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, really, if Trump were a fascist, we wouldn't be able to say he was a fascist. I mean, he'd shoot us right away. I mean,
we wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
I mean, yes, he may be a bad guy, but listen, there's a difference between a bad guy and Hitler. I mean, right? Just, even Pinochet is not Hitler. I mean, right?
But they've labeled.
I'm sure that the leaders know this
for a long time. They called Bush Hitler. You might remember that at the.
I do. If even Bush was Hitler, I mean, that was a sign that things were going. If Bush was Hitler, but not everybody was calling Bush Hitler, and you didn't have a Luigi Mangione sort of celebrated back then, right? But yes, in retrospect, that should have been a sign of where things were going. But
what do the liberals need to do? Like, does history teach us any lessons here? That you just mentioned that these people, the Fettermans, they're the majority, so they're going to decide. But they didn't decide in Russia, and often they don't. You remember when the provisional government was going on in 1917, there's the famous moment where they're all dickering around and they say, well, nobody really wants power. And Lenin goes, excuse me, one party does.
Right.
And, now you've got one party with Carville out there saying, don't campaign on making Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. states and packing the Supreme Court and things like this, but do it. So what needs to happen so that the cream, the revolutionary cream, if we call it that, doesn't wind up taking over, and the much broader group of people who might be progressive-minded and liberal, as you described, they take over? Because the arc of history doesn't always bend in the right way.
I don't think there is an arc of history.
Right.
History happens. There's no direction to history that's given, like a law of history. That's a Marxist idea or other group. History is what we make it.
So how do we make it?
Yeah. Well, the people who will really decide will be the people who speak to, that group of people. It will really be decided by, most liberal Democrats. What do they really want? They will, have to decide that. I mean, imagine right now, that the Republicans had all embraced Nick Fuentes. You'd have a really dangerous situation, okay?
Yeah.
Or imagine that, okay, they didn't all embrace him, but they didn't want to condemn them, okay? And there are some, like a few like that, but it's just not everybody, right? Well, it would clearly be a black mark, but that's what the mainstream Democrats have to resist, the equivalents in, in their party. And I think, as late as 10 years ago, I think they would have. The decline has been very rapid, which also means, there's a chance it could turn around. So I'm not absolutely hopeless, but things are going downhill, and you can, that's the people you have to appeal, so you get somebody who says, listen, we want more progressive taxation, we want, more of a welfare state, but we don't want to pack the cord and have a totalitarian society. That we don't want. That's what we need. I mean, right? That's what the alternative has to be, right? And if there are people like that, people who realize what the danger is, even if they don't agree with him on other things, ought to support them, because they're the ones who will determine what happens.
So I don't want to get too, dark as we look forward to the future here, but, I think your writings also point out a deeper problem. So you have an ideology that's been embraced that has a lot of really bad ideas, but starting chiefly with not only the importance, but the celebration of violence, breaking people into groups, equity instead of equality, a lack of principle, things being transactional. Man decides the world and the world's fate, not any pre-existing universal ideas. So you've written a lot about Solzhenitsyn, Dostoevsky, their movement towards more universal values, which we seem to have abandoned, whether it's Christian faith or you've also toward Judeo-Christian faith, and you've also talked about the importance of literature. So, on the one hand, we want people to just make a decision. I reject the dangerous direction, but you have to have a foundation of thought, sort of principles, of ideas that you care about. And, what have those ideas been in history? Maybe talk a little bit about what Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy and others talked about. And is there a chance of a revival for that sort of principled stand against this stuff?
Well, one thing I'd say about, Solzhenitsyn, if you read, his most famous book, The Gulag Archipelago, or some of his speeches, what he says is, how do you convince people who have not experienced communism how bad it is and that they should not go down that road? They're not immune to it. He asks that, right? Mm-hmm. And he thinks, this is a Nobel Prize speech too, the only way that you can convey to another what the experience was so they won't choose it is through literature. That's the role of literature. Now, in saying that, he's being very Russian, okay? Because for Russians, this is true to this day, true for 200 years, there is nothing more important in the world, in life, than literature, right? I mean, we sometimes think of, literature exists to reflect life. Russians are more likely to think, or as likely to think, that life exists to be made into literature. It is what life is about, okay? So in thinking that Solzhenitsyn is thinking that he can warn people in the West by great literature, well, I hope so, but we don't, there are a lot of even students in great universities who have never read a long book and don't want to read one today, right? They're used to short things. They're not dumb by any means. They're really good at math and science, and they can be very good at that. So they're anything but unintelligent. But that they've never been exposed to that, so you can't get them to. My job is to get them to love great literature, and that's what I try to do. And I think I'm reasonably successful at it. But it's it's increasingly more difficult because they have never, they can go through high school either without having read, any great literature, or they have read it in such a way, or been taught it in such a way, that no reasonable person would want to read anymore the way they've been taught it, right? I mean, if I had been taught it that way, I wouldn't want to read anymore. Solzhenitsyn, that's one thing Solzhenitsyn. The other you mentioned is that, he thinks that one of the problems that leads to this is, now he would say, radical materialism, which is to say there is nothing in the world other than atoms in motion. Now, if you really believe that, and this is, of course, goes right back to the great 19th century novelists like Dostoevsky, where do you get good and evil from? If I were to drop a pencil, right, it would fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. And then if I asked, is that moral or immoral, the question would be ridiculous, right? But if all we are atoms in motion, then all moral questions are simply social convention. They're ridiculous. They don't have any basis. That's, for Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, the problem with materialism. That is, it leads to complete amoralism, and with this nothing but power. Because what do you appeal to? What is not material that you can appeal to? Well, not all materialists, of course, go that far, but it's implicit in the philosophy, and some people go that far, and the others have difficulty formulating an objection. Before we got to this, embracing of Marxism and radical ideologies, the U.S. intelligentsia went through a period of radical relativism. They called it deconstruction or post-structuralism, which is to say, there is no essence of things. Truth is what you say is truth. There's nothing but power. A radical relativist position on the world. Well, how does radical relativism cohere with Marxism, which is anything but relativist? It's absolutist. But the answer is it prepares the ground by destroying other values, and then people need values, so they adopt it. That's right. It's contradictory. Relativism and Marxism are completely contradictory. It was completely rejected in the Soviet Union. Even agnosticism was rejected. But nevertheless, it can prepare the way for it. You see, you destroy old institutions first before you can create new ones. You have to destroy the old ones first. And that's the role that it goes. It plays that role, although it isn't where we're going to wind up if that happens.
Yeah, that's a scary part. Right, and all these people are in agreement that, to quote a political leader, that a fundamental transformation is desired, that this is something that we need, and so let's strive towards it. And I think maybe that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think maybe that's part of the reason, the sharing of that goal is part of the reason that the classical liberal part of the Democratic Party that we are talking about has failed thus far to condemn outright the stuff that it's seen, because they too want a fundamental transformation. Is that a correct reading of it, do you think?
No, you're giving them too much credit, I think. I think the psychology is something like this. You have been brought up in such a way that the one thing you must never do is side with people to your right. It's immoral. So you will side with people who are 10 miles to your left rather than 1 inch to your right. Okay? By the time you grow up, it's an automatic reaction. You know in advance what your position on the issue is, not because you've thought of the issue, but because of where people are positioned on it. So you can't, right? And so, if people say that opposing those people is right wing, they can't do it. Psychologically, they simply can't do it. Okay? It's not that they want fundamental transformation. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. I think most don't. I mean, most of them are very happy in their jobs and their income and, but the
common enemy.
They can't bear the thought that they are siding with conservatives. I mean, it's just not, or even moderates. They can't bear the offense to their own self-image of that. That's the crucial thing that's happening.
Okay, so common enemy more than common goal.
Yeah, and
so that really all the civility the civility that we're talking about, the old values of accommodation and compromise, is harder to achieve because, like you said, there's the psychology is at work here. It's not simply convincing somebody of the logic, rationality, necessity of a position because you can't overcome emotionally and culturally all the baggage they're bringing to seeing those questions, right? I mean,
democracy depends on the notion of a strong notion of opinion. That is, I think this way, you think that way, everybody's experience is partial. Yes, I think I'm right, but we're not guaranteed. We've been wrong in the past. Let's work things out together. Let us compromise. Lyndon Johnson's, favorite quotation from the Bible was, "Come, let us reason together." That's the spirit of democracy, okay? And you negotiate. But if you've got you don't negotiate about absolutes. You don't compromise about the Pythagorean theorem. I mean, it's you're right or you're wrong, right? And once everything is seen that way, the other side is simply evil, then you can't compromise, and democracy can't happen. You can only suppress other groups. You can't have two parties if one is evil, right? Then it's to say the other party is to say you want a one-party state. So it's the idea that compromise itself is bad, that you may not have the absolute truth, that other people have different opinions. That's where the problem lies, okay?
And it sounds like, can we crystallize it and say that it's this effort to turn your emotional and psychological truths into scientific truths? So you're bringing all this human baggage to these questions and then saying, it's the Pythagorean theorem, when it's actually just your emotional and psychological lens on things.
Yeah,
which makes
you call things, look, the Marxists, Marx distinguished himself from other socialists because he claimed to be scientific. He called it scientific socialism. They're just, utopian dreams in the air. Mine is based on hard science, he thought, right? Well, that once you have the strength of that idea is that then nobody can disagree because you can't disagree with science, okay? So the impulse is then call anything you want up to make impossible to disagree with, call it science. Okay, in an earlier age, in the Middle Ages, you would have called it heresy, right? Now you say you're anti-science. It plays the same role. Is it really science? Well, real science is, I think of, Richard Feynman's comment that, science is the refusal to accept authority. That's a paraphrase, but that was his thought. Once you can declare anything you believe in settled science, some things are more or less settled, some are less, right? But once you immediately leap to that, then, what you're saying is nobody has a right to disagree, and that's the appeal of saying it. You have to be careful not to call science anything you believe in.
Right.
I say this, by the way, as someone who, before I went into literature, was going to be a physicist, and I love and really respect science. But for that very reason, I worry about pseudoscience.
You have economic science and political science and sociology. And who better to run things than the experts in that?
When I was, when the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe still existed, I remember having trouble remembering which Germany was the communist and was divided, and which was the democratic. Was it the Federal Republic or the Democratic Republic of Germany? And then one day I realized the one that has to call itself democratic isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we have one discipline called physics and another called political science. Which is the science? If you call yourself a science, you probably aren't. Okay, the insistence that something is a science is already suspicious. Okay, I mean, physics, chemistry, those do not. Their results show that they're a science, right? Right. The results
And
of
it's an
economists and political scientists don't.
it's an odd thing that you can do those experiments in chemistry or biology and see that it's right and that it's true. And here
Yeah.
we have had these experiments with the political scientists and seen that they are horrid. And yet, as we were saying at the beginning, it still seems to attract people. Seems
Yeah, I
odd.
mean,
You run the
right, but
experiment, failed, but we're going to try it again.
yeah, if you want to explain the attraction of certain ideologies, thinking you can't do it strictly by, well, what would be the rational thing given the results of it? You hope that people would look at that, but that isn't really how most people arrive at their views. I mean, most people, particularly intellectuals, but most people, I think, who want to be part of a group of any sort, first decide what group they want to believe in, they want to be accepted by, and then adopt as a package all the beliefs of that group. That's why you find someone, if you know their views on gun control, you know their views on abortion, you know their views on everything, right? And it's why no argument about any particular view can dissuade them, no matter how strong the evidence, because they haven't arrived at that view by looking at the evidence. They've arrived at it by adopting a package. And it's to give it up would be to give up the whole package, which means giving up their identity.
Mm-hmm.
You can't pick and choose which beliefs of the package, or it's not a package. It's your identity, right? And when people adopt beliefs like that, you can't dissuade them by reason. You have to find some way of getting them to realize they don't want to identify with those people. That's the only thing you can do. It's a different strategy you have to use. And I don't know how to do it myself, but that's what you have to do.
And that identity, the identity serves a lot of purposes. And obviously what you just described is also religious faith. And you have a package of beliefs that allows you to see the world.
Yeah.
And it's got a lot of benefits. And that's one of the problems too, is there's a great power to having an organized, consistent set of values, beliefs, and assumptions that are shared by people in your community.
Yeah.
And to give that up comes at a price too.
That's right. Yeah. And another way is, if you only encounter people who share your beliefs. I mean, I remember growing up, before the Civil Rights Movement. And it was very easy when you lived in a segregated society to think that the people of the other race were just different from you and bad people. But once you were living with them, you realize they're people just like you. They're really not very different, okay? But the same thing we now have with, self-selecting neighborhoods on political views. It's easy to think that someone who doesn't belong to the same party as you, must be evil, right? We've segregated in a different way with similar results. I mean, that's the real problem. Universities having, what is the figure 36-1, leftist to rightists. And as, you might even point out, even that one is exaggerated because that guy the one is about to retire. He's the old
Or he's
guy.
in electrical engineering.
Yeah, I mean, right.
And that orthodoxy is ruthlessly enforced. So if you've adopted that package, like you were saying, you can't switch on one, or the other people with the package will cast you out. You'll become a pariah.
Yeah, right. And people are, I said in academia, people just are, even people with tenure who have secure jobs are incredibly scared of being ostracized in that way. They're really scared. Because it's very unpleasant. I mean, so they will find some way to, sign a petition they don't agree with by some mental reservation. Well, I agree with this paragraph. Or, yes, I don't agree with this, but not signing it would be a bad sign. Or, there'll be some excuse, that you will have. Academics are very good at coming up with excuses. They're good with words.
Well, I got to say, for Jim Varney and me, who, have had careers that have been outside, especially recently, legacy media, there's a lot of freedom in having burned the bridge. Like, we're never going to go work at the great celebrated places anymore for a variety of reasons. And, speaking your mind, speaking your truth, respecting that other people honestly disagree with you, is liberating in a way. And, we can hope that we can get back to that place at some point. And I think one of the ways we will is through incredibly thoughtful commentary, like you have written, Professor Morrison. And also, I will tell readers at the end of this YouTube video, we're going to have links to many of his pieces that we've discussed in this podcast today. But also, I think he would agree with me here, is go back and read the books that he loves. Go read Dostoevsky. Go read Tolstoy. Go read others. Reconnect with these giants, right?
And not just for political reasons. They will change your view of life. They will change your view of love, of meaning, of your soul. That's what Russian literature is really about. It's what great novels anywhere are about. I mean,
right.
You can.
And great ideas. I mean, great ideas, whether even religious ideas, at the end of the day, are respecting other people as being as worthy as you, of having the same dignity as you, but also they're as fallible as you. People make mistakes. People, you can think, have wrong ideas, and that's not a crime. People come to positions in lots of different ways, and I think literature not only, provide you a model for seeing the world, for also recognizing the fallibility. The greatest characters in literature have problems, right?
One of my favorite passages in War and Peace, I just happen to have taught it, is Peder, one of the heroes, who thinks he has the absolute truth and gives a speech. And what really bothers him is not the people who disagree, but the people who agree with him, but with stipulations and, that they don't exactly, because he wants his views to be accepted 100%. And then Tolstoy has the line, at that moment, he became aware of the endless variety of human minds, which prevents any truth from being exactly the same to any two people.
Right.
Now, that sense of the radical individuality of individuals, that is really the beginning of, human wisdom, right? And of tolerance and of understanding of others, right? That's what you need empathy for. You don't need empathy if everybody thinks the same way, right? And what novels are really good at is teaching both emotional and intellectual empathy. That is, how to put yourself in the position of somebody other than yourself.
Right. Exactly. Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Indeed. I was really looking forward to this.
Well, thank you for having me.
And want to thank you for all your work. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in, as always. Please go to the bottom of this YouTube and click on Professor Morson's articles. Please go to RealClearInvestigations.com, where you can read the work by Jim Varney and other original articles we publish, as well as aggregation of the best investigative journalism done around the country and the world. And also follow us at RC Investigates on Twitter. Until next week, I'm Peder Zane, Jim Varney, saying so long. Thank you.